It's January the 8th, 2020. This is 508, a show about Worcester. I am Mike Benedetti. This is Brendan Melican.
Happy New Year, Mike.
Happy New Year, Brendan. A lot of people are talking about how this is potentially going to be a terrible year.
Well, this is the worst year ever.
How could anybody think that was going to happen?
I don't know. I think we're off to a good start.
Yeah. You know what? I want to talk about Worcester news, and then I want to talk about the second coming after that. We'll start off with Worcester in 60 seconds. Give people what they need to know, what they might want to know. The City Council has set the 2020 property tax rate at $17 per $1,000 of assessed valuation for residential properties, down from $18, and $35.16 for commercial properties, up from $34.90. Most councilors approved this change, but those voting opposed were Mayor Petty and Councilors Rivera, Toomey, and Wally. The council has voted for hearings on making city buses free to ride. Our buses are currently at 45% capacity, and our bus system makes about $3 million a year from fares, which is about 15% of total revenues. It costs us about $850,000 a year to collect the fares, and going fare free might mean that expense goes to zero, and it might not. WGBH is opening a Worcester News Bureau on Federal Street, where the TNG used to be. They note that they now have the largest footprint for news in the Commonwealth, and that they have already been consistently reporting on key stories from Worcester. That's really all I think that's gone on so far in the city the past week.
I'm up to date.
Yeah.
A nice note, just because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't really talk much about budget and tax cycle stuff before the end of the last year. While the tax rate for residential properties went down, your taxes still went up. And I feel it's incumbent upon myself to remind homeowners that this is what you get when you continuously vote for this weird split rate that we have, that yes, the percentage went down, but because of math and that your valuation went up, your taxes still went up.
Because your property value went up.
Your property value went up.
So unless you're selling your house, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Yeah, well, unless we do something a little bit more long-term and strategic in terms of our taxation policy.
To ruin the city of Worcester. You know, Brendan, before talking about anything too depressing, I wanted to talk about this week's cover article for Worcester Magazine, their cover story by Bill Shaner, Food, Clothing, Love. The mustard seed is an indispensable resource for Worcester's hungry, homeless. I appreciate the first two words in the article are Mike Benedetti.
Wonderful. Well done, though. That was a really good story, man.
You know, it is a good story. And they always say, I mean, I've complained about so many articles down through the years, including I will complain about some articles today, I'm sure. They always say that whenever you read an article by a journalist about something that you know something about, that's when you realize they get so much stuff wrong in that article.
Sure.
And by extrapolating, probably in every article. And whenever I've read articles about projects I was involved with, if it was more than 75% accurate, I always you count yourself lucky and say,
that's
great,
a win.
This is basically good enough. You know, these guys are writing these articles in 45 minutes. You know, journalists, they just have a deadline to meet. That's the big thing about it being a journalist, right? It's like you're writing to a deadline. You're not like some novelist who's going off on a retreat in Kansas for 6 months to write your article about the mustard seed. You just got to get it done and get on to something else. This article is 100% accurate, Brendan. This is 100% accurate. And I have to say, I mean...
Bill, you hit it out of the park.
Yeah, it's true. I really feel like this is almost like a short story that sort of just is a nice little, I'm going to compare this to maybe James Joyce's Dubliners for just like capturing a little cameo portrait of a certain time and place.
That's what I loved reading about it, because you've shared with me enough about your experiences at the Mustard Seed, and I've never been there with you to see this stuff firsthand. The language that Bill used to describe things it mirrored the way you describe the place week to week when you tell me about your adventures down there, and it was just great to read.
You know, I've been involved with a lot of these Catholic worker kind of projects down over the decades at this point, including the Mustard Seed is one of them. And I think that one of the tricky things about describing them is that everybody is very much on the same page as far as what is the mission and how are we getting there. But the people who are doing this are such a diverse group of wackos that sometimes watching them all, come together, it just looks like a bunch of clowns running around on the ground of the circus. And when they suddenly, all take one step to the right and suddenly it forms like a smiley face or whatever, an American flag, you're like, oh, wow, like Order Out of Chaos, that was amazing. But that's hard to capture in an article, that combination of like, okay, I was there and it seemed like it was a bunch of maniacs. Mm-hmm. But then I could also see that there was this whole It's actually a bunch of people trying to help other people,
Yeah.
and also while looking like a bunch of maniacs.
Yeah. It
So
definitely, you could pull the maniac part out, but yeah, it was very well done.
good job, Bill Shaner. Good job. I mean, good job, Worcester journalism. This definitely gives me hope for
Good job, Mike Benedetti. I mean, that's an incredible resource. And again, Bill did a great job painting a picture. I guess I take for granted the fact that you just tell me so much about what goes on down there that it's just something that I wait for on at least a biweekly basis to hear the latest stories about. But it was really nice to read it through a external set of eyes. I mean, it's clearly an important resource, and folks are clearly doing great work down there, and you've done a lot in terms of the volunteers. So
I tell you,
kudos to you, man.
Brendan Melican. One of the things that I feel like is stressing me out as we go into 2020 is wondering, what does a coherent life look like in this year, in this time of America?
Oh, that's still a thing?
How leading a coherent life?
Leading a coherent life?
Well, I tell you, just this morning watching the news and just talking about Worcester, I just wanted to read.
I mean, you walked into this room with me reading a book about mass extinction, and I'm doing that just as a sort of a form of solace. I'm doing that just
Yes.
my form of escapism from reality is to read about the extinctions that I'm likely to live through in this life. So,
I mean,
yeah.
we have this whatever conflicts we have, military conflicts going on. You know, I'm just reading some stuff about climate change and fighting against climate change, which notes that as much as much CO2 as flying in a plane causes, if you're the only person on a city bus, it's like 3 times as much per mile. And I was thinking about how much of the time am I the only person on a city bus? All the time.
Your fault.
That bus would be going in any case probably down that route.
Yeah.
But I mean, in some way, am I responsible for, or just being in that situation of like, yeah, like we might as well just have people rolling coal. It would be better than having this city bus driving with just me in it or just with nobody in it.
I just want a full day that I can just worry about polar ice caps melting without having anything else slide into my head that's just completely awful. Just one day.
You know what Yeats said, Brendan? He said, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. America in 2020. It's a great place. It's a great place.
Yeah. Thanks, Yates.
Yeah. Hey, so we got some feedback from. I wanted to read this. Just wanted to read this feedback. This is from Nicole Apostola, who is a frequent, actually a frequent semi-producer of this show down through the years. So
the show couldn't have happened as long as it has without Nicole's research. Yeah.
Absolutely, Nicole has done a ton of outreach and a ton of researching for the show over the years. Also, not always happy with the show. So I think we'll comment on this, but I don't want to sort of go line by line about whether we agree with this or disagree with this. I just want to get this on the record. Nicole writes, rarely has an episode of 508 ticked me off as much as this one did. First, we live in a city that has repeatedly told residents they can't have decent things like replacements for existing neighborhood poles, benches in the downtown, or reliable bus service. Somehow we find millions for a ballpark, though, and take the worst possible deal in order to make that happen. This is not progress. Second, there is currently a home buying program that is targeting people who live outside the city to come on down and buy here, which is truly a slap in the face to people who have been living here and watching a rising tide that is not lifting their boats. The three-decker is more than something that goes on a hipster's t-shirt. It was a way for generations of immigrant and poor families to own a home, pay a low mortgage, and give relatives a roof over their head. Right now, the city is more than willing to let these properties be bought by absentee landlords rather than investing in people who live here. Yes, this is a housing stock that needs to be improved, but it can also be a way for things to get better for existing city residents. Rolling out the red carpet to the latest flashy developer from the East, while simultaneously telling people who live here to grin and bear it, has been a recurring theme in this city. It's not getting better. One more thing. It's just not true that no one lived downtown and that now, as a result of the Renaissance, they do. People have always lived downtown, and more people live there now. Many, many more people lived there 60 to 70 years ago before the area was declared blighted and in need of the urban renewal renaissance. It is the same mythology that derives statements like no one goes to the Midtown Mall. When the powers that be don't know anyone who frequents certain establishments or living in a certain area, it becomes that much easier to declare it dead or blighted and that much easier to assume control of.
I was laughing while you were talking because while you were looking down, Nicole actually left a comment on Facebook saying that it just popped up here saying that she's almost never happy with the show. So I just thought that was That was nice.
Well, I want to thank Nicole for her many hours of working on something that at the end of the day is still disappointing to her.
It still disappoints you. Yeah, no, and I don't disagree really with any of those. I've tried really hard to find fault with Nicole's comments, and there's really nothing you can argue with. I was thinking more and more, more I let it stew actually in my head, that for myself, I think that the problem is, and this is directed at me, been around long enough now as an adult where I can't look at things that I disagree with how they've come to fruition without acknowledging that I was there when those processes started and could have done something about it then. Like, and so like a lot of what we see happening in the city now, it's easy to blame like Ed Augustus or Mayor Petty or whoever for, but these things started 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're starting to roll out now. So it's like, as someone who was a frequent apologist for like Mike O'Brien, I never threw Mike O'Brien off of a rooftop, right? Like I had that opportunity plenty of times. I'm glad that I didn't. I'd be in prison. Now with the show would be miserable if you'd be waiting for me to get out of prison. But it's like I could have done that and stopped a lot of the things that are happening in the city now from moving forward, but it didn't. And it's like I think there's a level of self-awareness that has to come into play too. Again, speaking for myself, that a lot of these things happened on the timeline they're happening because of the participation of, or lack thereof, of people like myself.
Then, I mean, not only did you not assassinate the city manager, but you did not, oppose certain aspects of what he was doing, or you didn't oppose him, or, there were plenty of opportunities for you to, for you to just like voice your dissatisfaction with things. And
but in real time, a lot of the things that were rolled out seemed like, okay, that's going to end up being better than it is now, and is often the case. Things get a little squicky and go sideways in the process. I just hope that on a long enough timeline, as opposed to people get it, which I see more and more. This has nothing to do with Nicole. This is actually, I think, a generation behind us that instead of getting just angry at people online, more and more people are actually getting engaged in the city to direct where things are today, move in a positive direction that isn't completely controlled by outside interests that couldn't give a care in the world. I almost swore there, Mike, about Worcester residents. It's a sign of adulthood. I can catch my own swearing. That never happens.
That's a sign of being on cable access too long. Back when this was just a podcast, we didn't care. We would talk about, anyway.
Yeah, no, and that's it. I think it's just, I hope that younger cats are paying attention to this. And again, where are we at now? 17% voter turnout, local elections. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're passionate about the direction of where the city's headed, that's going to change. That's going to change drastically. And it's not just complaining about where things are today. It's where they're actually going.
This is going to be weird. I've, like I said about what does a coherent life look like, I've just sort of felt like, I felt like I don't know what, I feel like there's a lot of things in my life that I care about, a lot of institutions that I'm connected with in some way that feel to me like they're falling apart, they're decaying, they're not going in the right direction. And that I know that there's a lot of other people who are not happy with that either. Mm-hmm. And that there's plenty of people who are working on it, but I don't really see a lot of leadership on these areas. I don't really feel the sense of that there's a lot of mentorship in these areas. And I don't feel like the groups that are working on these things have a plausible strategy.
Right.
Like, so you may be like, climate change is terrible. And it's like, what's your solution? Well, we're going to ban plastic drinking straws. And it's like, okay, that we all agree that that's not going to work. Like we can both all write stuff on the back of a napkin and agree that's not going to work. So what's step 2? And I'm not saying that people are dumb. I think people frequently are just working on whatever they have, but they just don't have a plausible strategy. So you work on something.
Step 2 is always complain about the Golden Globes.
You work on something, but you don't have a plausible strategy. And this is just me being like, I would happily join your group if you had a plausible strategy.
Right.
I wish I could come up with a plausible strategy. I definitely, like you said about feeling responsible for the O'Brien administration, I feel responsible that there's not a plausible strategy on a million things in this world, because I feel like I'm the kind of guy who over intellectualizes things and talks about things too much.
Sure.
And frequently that's where the plausible strategies in this world come from, is just the sort of white noise of those guys getting filtered down into something that's a signal.
Absolutely. No, I agree fully. And also I've never had any real interest in the sort of, like you phrased, leadership side of things. I'm too suspicious of leaders to ever want to really be one.
Well,
Bunch of grifters, if you ask me.
Well, I tell you, bringing this back to Worcester, I was surprised to look at the this article in the Telegram by Nick Kotsopoulos. Worcester Mayor Petty outlines goals for city's future at inaugural ceremony, and that the things that he's talking about, the highlights of the speeches Nick brings them. It's like, okay, we're gonna move the DPW offices. We're going to get a bunch of people together and figure out how to do this. A bunch of stakeholders together. We're going to have a 24-hour customer service center. We're going to have an advisory committee on housing to try to figure out some sort of more concrete city steps on gentrification. We're going to try to advocate for a new Burncoat High School and a Worcester East Middle School. I mean, these are all like actual things that actually feel like they're part of a coherent, what you might call a grand strategy, or just part of a coherent strategy for Worcester. And you may not like this idea of like, this is the way things are going, but I feel like all of these things point to pushing things in a certain way, and they all make sense in that, I just feel like in so many areas, U.S. Middle Eastern policy is a great one, where it's like, what's the big strategy? Like, we knew what the big strategy was in 1985. Post-Cold War, what's the big strategy? Which, I mean, the big strategy is some combination of acting like it's 1985 and kicking the can down the road.
Right.
In light of that, or in light of whatever people's crazy neocon idea, well, we're going to overthrow all the governments in the Middle East. And they're all going to become up roses. That's the strategy. Like, in light of that, you almost can't make any policy, Middle Eastern policy, that makes any sense. And when you're critiquing it, every policy that you critique, you can just be like, yeah, this doesn't really make any sense based on what else we've done. But it's like, well, none of what we're doing is making sense because it's not all connected by a single strategy that you can either say yes or no about it because of. Like, I appreciate that in the city, and I can't believe that I'm criticizing, I'm saying like, good job, Joe Petty, on your leadership, because I feel like he's a very laid back guy. He's been a very laid back leader, but he has been the mayor of the city, and he is being like, yeah, here's like the stuff we're going to do, and these are like actual things. Like, even something like having a city commission on housing and gentrification feels like, for some cities, I think it would be just like more of the same, like, oh, great, more meetings. But for the city of Worcester, this is like an actual thing that we haven't really done.
Yeah, and I hope that we're able to. You mentioned sort of like federal foreign policy. And I think we've got a really good example on a local level, and that's Worcester, deciding that it was like going to be a sanctuary city, right, of sorts, right? Like,
yes,
that's the better example because it keeps it local, right? And it was philosophically, it's a great thing, but even practically, it's just a really, really good thing, right? It's local officials saying, hey, you know what? It's not our job to enforce federal law. Like, there's this whole Constitution thing. Like, we're not supposed to be doing that in the first place. It would make no sense for us to be anything but this with that label, no matter how many people it upsets. So, like, you get this rare opportunity where, like, philosophically and practically speaking, policy aligns perfectly. And if you're going to argue against it, it's either you didn't make it through elementary school civics and social studies, or you're just a really awful person. And I hope, and again, it's not going to happen overnight, because I think more people need to feel a personal attachment to something similar to why we went down that road in speaking about immigration policy. When it comes to something like housing, I think it's gonna take more people actually feeling a squeeze before everyone is just able to get on the same page and say, you know what, like, we've got a lot of tents, like, in the city. Like, we've got way too many homeless people that, like, there's no, like, no coherent solution for. Like, we've got way too many people who are working their asses off to stay afloat and can barely make that happen. And it doesn't necessarily need to be painted with a broad brush in terms of, like, the national conversations that are happening about gentrification. The city of Worcester just needs to have a really good plan that works for itself and ensures that the people that are here now are being taken care of, as opposed to, correctly, to Nicole's point, that we're doing a really great job of marketing to outside forces. But that latter part is easy, right? Because it's private dollars and investment dollars that are making that happen. It's like, this is where it becomes incumbent upon us as locals to be saying, like, wait, well, like, what are we doing to make sure that we're taking care of the people that are here now? And I don't feel like there's been a lot of, not just call for, but a lot of reason for even the engaged members of the electorate to be thinking in that capacity very much. But the city is changing so quickly from an economic perspective. I think it's going to feel necessary to even folks that have been ignoring a lot of those issues for some time now.
Brent crude oil is $67 a barrel. up 1% on the week, not surprisingly, and up 19% on the year, not surprisingly. Bitcoin is $8,300, up 16% on the week, and up 108% on the year. Holy cow, man! Bitcoin. Who knew?
More is good for Bitcoin.
Who knew? You know, this is I don't know. I mean, I feel like I don't know. Luckily, there has not been like a gigantic amount of crazy negative news in the city of Worcester the last couple of weeks. Or, you know, this is the time of year where we don't really need news. Any news we're going to have is going to be bad. Like, other than like stuff like people are coming into office and passing a tax rate. Like, otherwise, this is just time of year everybody's still kind of getting their feet under them.
Yeah.
I was reading this article. This is an article by Tyler Cowen called "What Libertarianism Has Become and Will Become: State Capacity Libertarianism." And as Worcester's libertarian voice, I think it's important that we should confront the crisis of libertarianism in modern America, in 21st century America, in Donald Trump's America, as well as Brendan Milliken's America. This is an interesting article to me, not only because it was an interesting article, but because there was actually an op-ed in both Reason and in the Washington Post directly responding to this.
Oh, no kidding.
So yeah, so I felt like this is like, okay, this is like a real blog post, like back in the day where people read it and then they respond to it.
Yeah, because it is an interesting question. Like, what does it mean to be a libertarian in 2020 is similar to like the question of like, what does it mean to be a white guy who probably doesn't get out enough in 2020? Like, they're very similar questions.
It is true. Well, so I'll read the core part of this. Tyler, who is a libertarian-ish economics professor, writes, having tracked the libertarian, quote, movement, unquote, not sure why the scare quotes, for much of my life, I believe it is now pretty much hollowed out. One branch split off into Ron Paulism in less savory alt-right directions, and another more establishment branch remains out there in force, but not really commanding new adherents. For one thing, it doesn't seem that old-style libertarianism can solve or even very well address a number of major problems, most significantly climate change. Along the way, I believe that smart classical liberals and libertarians have evolved into a view that I dub state capacity libertarianism. This would include certain aspects of thinking such as this proposition: markets and capitalism are very powerful, that earlier in history a strong state was necessary to back the formation of capitalism and also to protect individual rights. Strong states remain necessary to maintain and extend capitalism and markets, that a strong state is distinct from a very large or tyrannical state, that rapid increases in state capacity can be very dangerous, but high levels of state capacity are not inherently tyrannical, that many of the failures of today's America are failures of excess regulation, but many others are failures of state capacity, and that state capacity libertarianism recognizes that demands of mercy, such as, so this is sort of in responding to like, so how does this sort of contrast with like a kind of a general late 20th century, neoliberal vibe. And he says, well, state capacity libertarian recognizes that demands of mercy are never ending, that economic growth can benefit people more than transfers, and within the governmental sphere is willing to emphasize an analytical, cold-hearted comparison between government discretionary spending and transfer spending, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about, do you have any response to this?
No, I don't.
Where libertarianism is in this?
I've put that part of my life so far behind me as my angsty.
No, you're living that part of your life right now.
That's far from true. But this is I think the neat thing about libertarianism as a philosophy, it makes a really, really good philosophy, right? And then it's one of those things that and I think that's kind of what Tyler Cowen is getting at to some extent there. Then when you get a little bit more in the weeds, you realize this is not the philosophy that we should be using to solve any major problems at all, right? Like if we're going to expect the folks at Reason Magazine to come up with a healthy solution to polar ice caps melting, like
bridge maintenance.
Yeah, no, we should just walk away from this now before it's too late. But from a philosophical perspective, I think there is something to be said for the idea of some of the core tenets of libertarianism, but it needs to be left at that. It needs to be left at a.
I think that a lot of well, great, our camera has crashed. We're gonna keep doing this we're gonna keep doing this in audio only, if not in video. I think it's very reasonable to I feel this is good. I can edit out this awkward pause here. There's a lot of philosophies that make sense in a certain context and don't make sense in a certain other context. And that it's totally valid to have those philosophies because you're always in a context.
Right.
You don't need to have a philosophy that makes sense in all contexts. You just need to have a philosophy that makes sense in your context.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I guess that's what I'm getting at too. It's like in the same way that I think most people would acknowledge that a theocracy